On June 28, 1914, a Serbian nationalist fired 2 bullets into the chest of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in the streets of Sarajevo. Those 2 bullets didn't just kill an Austrian prince. They triggered a financial apocalypse that would drain the accumulated wealth of an entire continent. What followed was not just a war of trenches and machine guns. It was the greatest act of economic suicide in human history. By the time the guns fell silent in November 19, Europe had burned through 4 centuries of accumulated capital in just 4 years. The old world of bankers, bonds, and gold standard stability was dead. And in its place rose a continent of debtors, beggars, and broken currencies. To understand the scale of the destruction, you have to understand what Europe looked like before the war. In 1914, Europe was the richest place on earth. London, Paris, Berlin, and Vienna were the financial capitals of the world. European investors owned railroads in Argentina, mines in South Africa, and plantations in Asia. The European powers had spent the entire 19th century accumulating wealth through trade, colonization, and industrial expansion. They had built vast reserves of gold. They had developed sophisticated banking systems. They had created a web of international credit that financed global commerce. The British pound, the French franc, and the German mark were as good as gold. You could walk into any bank in the world and exchange them at fixed rates. This was the era of the classical gold standard, a time when money had real value backed by metal in a vault. But beneath this glittering surface, the European powers were also building another kind of reserve. They were stockpiling weapons. The arms race of the early 20th century was driven by a dangerous assumption. Military planners believed that the next war would be short and decisive. They looked at the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, which had lasted only 6 months, and assumed that modern industrial warfare would be quick. Armies would mobilize, clash in a few massive battles, and then one side would surrender. The economists and politicians agreed. They calculated that no modern economy could sustain a long war. The cost of mobilizing millions of men, the disruption to trade, the expense of ammunition and supplies, it would be too much. Everyone believed that financial exhaustion would force a quick peace. They were catastrophically wrong. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28, 1914, the dominoes began to fall. Russia mobilized to defend Serbia. Germany mobilized to support Austria. France mobilized because it was allied with Russia. Britain mobilized because Germany invaded Belgium. Within 2 weeks, the entire continent was at war. And within 2 months, the financial systems of Europe began to crack. The first casualty was the gold standard. As soon as the war started, people panicked. They rushed to the banks to withdraw their money and convert it into gold. They wanted to hoard the real stuff before the paper became worthless. The central banks of Europe watched in horror as their gold reserves began to drain. In Britain, France, and Germany, long lines formed outside the banks. The governments had no choice. They suspended gold competition. They made it illegal to exchange paper money for gold. The link between currency and metal, the foundation of the entire financial system, was severed. This was supposed to be a temporary emergency measure. It would last for decades. Next came the war bonds. Every government faced the same problem. Modern war was obscenely expensive. It wasn't just about paying soldiers. It was about feeding them, clothing them, arming them, and transporting them. It was about building tanks, planes, and battleships. It was about producing millions of artillery shells. A single day of bombardment on the Western Front could cost more than an entire year of pre-war military spending. The governments couldn't pay for this with tax revenue. Taxes take time to collect, and the armies needed money immediately. So they turned to borrowing. They issued war bonds, promising to pay back the investors with interest after the war was won. The bond campaigns were massive propaganda efforts. In Britain, posters showed brave soldiers with captions asking, "Are you doing your bit?" In Germany, the Kaiser himself appeared at bond rallies. In France, children were encouraged to buy bonds with their pocket money. The appeal was always the same: lend your money to the government now, and when we win, you'll get it back with profit. The implicit promise was that the defeated enemy would pay for everything through reparations. The public believed it. Millions of ordinary citizens, driven by patriotism and the promise of profit, bought war bonds. In Germany, the war bonds were called Krieges. The German government issued 9 separate bond drives between 1914 and 1980, raising over 100 billion marks. In France, the government raised over 150 billion francs. In Britain, The war bonds were so popular that even working-class families scraped together savings to buy them. It was an unprecedented transfer of private wealth into government hands. The people were literally funding their own destruction, but the bonds weren't enough. The cost of the war was so staggering that even the most successful bond drives could unkeep pace. So the governments did something they had promised never to do. They printed money. The printing presses ran day and night. In Germany, the Reichsbank began issuing new marks to pay for supplies. In France, the Banque de France did the same with francs. In Russia, the printing of rubles became so frantic that the government ran out of high-quality paper and started using lower grades. The result was predictable. Inflation, as more and more paper money flooded the economy, chasing fewer and fewer goods, prices began to rise. In Germany, the price of bread doubled, then tripled. In France, the cost of coal skyrocketed. In Russia, the inflation was so severe that by 1917, a loaf of bread cost 10 times what it had in 1914. The soldiers' families, waiting at home, watched their savings evaporate. The war bonds they had bought with patriotic fervor were being devalued by their own government printing presses. But the soldiers at the front didn't care about inflation. They were living in a different kind of hell. The trenches of the Western Front became the most expensive piece of real estate in history. Every meter of ground gained or lost came with an astronomical price tag. Consider the Battle of Verdun in 1916. The French and Germans slaughtered each other for 10 months over a 10-kilometer stretch of muddy hills. The French fired 10 million artillery shells. The Germans fired 30 million. Each shell cost money to manufacture, money to transport, and money to fire. The economist John Maynard Keynes later calculated that the Battle of Verdun alone cost more than the entire Napoleonic Wars combined. And Verdun was just one battle. There was the Somme, where the British fired 1.7 million shells in the first week alone. There was Passchendaele, where men drowned in mud while their governments drowned in debt. The industrialization of killing had created an economic black hole. The factories of Europe, which had once produced textiles, furniture, and consumer goods, were now entirely devoted to producing instruments of death. This meant that the civilian economy was starving. There were no new clothes being made, no new houses being built, no new tools being manufactured. Everything was going to the front. At the same time, the agricultural workforce had been conscripted into the armies. The young men who should have been plowing fields and harvesting crops were instead being fed into the meat grinder of the trenches. Food production collapsed. In Germany, the situation became so desperate that the winter of 1916 to 1917 was called the turnip winter. The potato crop had failed, and people were forced to eat turnips, a vegetable normally fed to livestock. In Britain, the government introduced rationing. In France, bread lines stretched 4 blocks. And where was the food coming from to fill these gaps? It was being imported from across the Atlantic, from the United States and Canada, and it had to be paid for in hard currency. This is where the transfer of wealth from Europe to America truly began. The United States, sitting comfortably across the ocean, untouched by the fighting, became the arsenal and granary of the Allies. American factories produced steel, explosives, and weapons. American farms produced wheat, beef, and pork. And the European Allies paid for it all. At first, they paid with gold. Ships loaded with gold bars crossed the Atlantic, moving the metal wealth of London and Paris to the vaults of New York. Then they paid by selling their foreign investments. British investors owned vast holdings in American railroads, mines, and industrial corporations. The British government forced them to sell these assets at fire sale prices to raise dollars. The investments that had taken generations to build up were liquidated in months. But even that wasn't enough. By 1917, Britain and France were broke. They had no more gold to ship. They had no more assets to sell. They had to borrow. They went hat in hand to the American banks and the American government, begging for loans. The Americans, seeing an opportunity, lent them the money, but on American terms. By the end of the war, Britain owed the United States over $4 billion. France owed $3 billion. Italy owed $1.6 billion. These were astronomical sums, far beyond anything that had ever been owed between nations before. The financial center of gravity had shifted. Before the war, Europe had been the creditor to the world. After the war, Europe was the debtor and America was the banker. But the worst financial catastrophe was unfolding in the East. In Russia, The cost of the war had done more than bankrupt the treasury. It had destroyed the entire social order. The Tsarist government, already fragile, collapsed under the weight of military defeat and economic chaos. When the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, one of their first acts was to repudiate all foreign debts. They simply declared that they would not pay back the billions of rubles that the Tsarist government had borrowed from France, Britain, and other countries. It was the largest sovereign default in history. French investors, many of them small savers who had bought Russian bonds as a safe investment, lost everything. Entire fortunes were wiped out overnight. Meanwhile, in Germany, the economic situation was becoming a slow-motion train wreck. The British naval blockade had cut Germany off from global trade. No food could come in. No raw materials could come in. The German people were slowly starving. By 1918, the average German was surviving on 1,000 calories a day, half of what a human body needs. Children were suffering from rickets and malnutrition. The Spanish flu, which swept the world in 1918, hit Germany particularly hard because the population was already weakened by hunger. The German government kept printing money to pay for the war, but the money was becoming worthless. The mark, which had been a symbol of German economic strength, was turning into confetti, and still the war dragged on. The German generals, living in a fantasy world, believed they could still win. They launched one final desperate offensive in the spring of 1918, throwing everything they had at the Western Front. It failed. The Allies, now reinforced by fresh American troops and American money, the German army, exhausted and starving, began to collapse. On November 11th, 1980, the armistice was signed. The war was over. The continent breathed a collective sigh of relief, but the financial damage was done, and it was irreversible. The numbers were staggering. The total direct cost of the war was estimated at over $200 billion, equivalent to trillions in today's money. But that was just the direct cost, the money spent on guns, shells, and soldiers. The indirect costs were far higher. Entire cities had been destroyed. The industrial regions of northern France and Belgium were wastelands. Factories had been bombed, mines had been flooded, rail lines had been ripped up. The productive capacity of Europe had been gutted. Millions of men, the most productive members of society, were dead. They would never build houses, start businesses, or raise children. The human capital loss was incalculable, but the financial wound went even deeper. The war bonds that had been sold to millions of patriotic citizens were now a ticking time bomb. The governments had promised to repay these bonds with interest. But where would they get the money? Their economies were shattered. Their tax bases had collapsed. The only solution was to print more money, which would cause more inflation, which would devalue the bonds even further. The investors who had lent their savings to the government were about to discover that their patriotism had been rewarded with bankruptcy. In Germany, this dynamic would spiral completely out of control. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, imposed reparations on Germany. The Allies demanded that Germany pay for the entire cost of the war, 132 billion gold marks. It was an impossible sum. Germany couldn't pay it, even if it wanted to. But the Allies insisted. The French, in particular, were determined to make Germany bleed. The German government, trapped between the Allied demands and its own domestic debts, did the only thing it could. It printed more money. The mark began to collapse. By 1921, it took 100 marks to buy what 1 mark had bought before the war. By 1922, it took 10,000 marks. And then the situation entered the realm of madness. In 1923, the Weimar hyperinflation reached its peak. The exchange rate went from 1,000 marks to the dollar to 1 million marks to the dollar to 1 trillion. Marks to the dollar. People were carrying money in wheelbarrows to buy a loaf of bread. Workers were paid twice a day because if they waited until the end of the day, their wages would be worthless. Life savings were wiped out. The middle class, which had dutifully bought war bonds and saved in banks, was financially annihilated. A lifetime of careful saving could now buy a postage stamp. The social trauma was profound. The German people felt betrayed, humiliated, and desperate. This desperation would later be exploited by a failed Austrian painter named Adolf Hitler. But Germany wasn't alone in its suffering. Across Europe, the currencies were in chaos. In Austria, the crown collapsed. In Hungary, the peng became worthless. In Poland, The mark lost almost all its value. Even in the victorious countries, the financial pain was severe. In Britain, the return of soldiers created mass unemployment. The industries that had been producing weapons suddenly had no orders. In France, the cost of reconstruction was enormous. The government had to borrow even more money just to rebuild the destroyed regions. Taxes were raised to crushing levels, but still, the debt grew. The French franc, once a symbol of stability, lost 80% of its value in the decade after the war. The small investors who had bought war bonds found that their investment was now worth a fraction of what they had paid. The promise of profit had been a lie. The political consequences of this financial devastation were catastrophic. In Russia, the economic chaos had enabled the Bolsheviks to seize power, creating the Soviet Union. In Italy, economic instability and a sense of betrayal over the peace treaty enabled Mussolini's fascists to march on Rome in 1922. In Germany, the hyperinflation destroyed the credibility of the Weimar Republic, paving the way for the Nazis. The financial destruction of World War I created the conditions for World War II. The Treaty of Versailles, which was supposed to bring peace, instead planted the seeds of the next war because it was built on a foundation of economic fantasy. The Allies believed that Germany could be made to pay for everything. They believed that the old world could be restored if they just squeezed hard enough. But you cannot squeeze blood from a stone. The ultimate irony of World War I is that nobody won. The Central Powers lost and were destroyed. But the Allied powers won and were bankrupted. The only true victor was the United States, which emerged from the war as the world's leading economic power. The gold that had once sat in the vaults of London, Paris, and Berlin now sat in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The financial dominance that Europe had enjoyed for centuries had been transferred across the Atlantic in just 4 years. The old European aristocracy, the bankers, the bondholders, the investors, all saw their wealth evaporate. The old certainties, the gold standard, the balance of power, the belief in progress, all were shattered. The world that emerged from the war was darker, poorer, and more violent. The story of World War I is not just a story of battles and trenches. It is a story of how a civilization can destroy itself through its own choices. The European powers chose to fight a war they couldn't afford. They chose to finance it by debasing their currencies and lying to their citizens. They chose to continue the slaughter long after it was clear that no victory was worth the costs, and they paid the price. The war consumed the wealth of an entire continent, wealth that had taken centuries to accumulate. It destroyed currencies, bankrupted governments, and impoverished millions of innocent people who had trusted their leaders. It was the most expensive war in history, not just in terms of money spent, but in terms of the future that was lost. The children who should have been born were never conceived because their fathers died in the mud. The businesses that should have been built were never started because the capital was spent on bullets. The scientific discoveries that should have been made were delayed because the researchers were killed. The cost of World War I cannot be measured in dollars or pounds or marks. It can only be measured in the decades of suffering that followed. I'm Adam, and this is the Prime History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it.